Just trust me and sign, my son said as the nurse rolled me toward the hospital exit. That was the sentence. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I was still weak from the heart attack. 11 days in the cardiac unit had left me feeling older than 72. My chest no longer hurt, not really, but I could still feel the memory of pain sitting there like a warning. I wanted to go home. I wanted my own bed, my own coffee mug, my own quiet. Daniel stood in front of me holding a clipboard. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, stood a few feet behind him, checking her phone with the kind of patience that isn't patience at all. The kind that says, let's get this over with. What is it? I asked. Just discharge paperwork, Daniel said. Insurance coordination, account stuff, routine signatures. No one had explained anything to me. I glanced at the papers, but my reading glasses were packed away in the overnight bag Vanessa was carrying. The words swam together. Daniel noticed me hesitate. Dad, he said, lowering his voice the way people do when they're trying to sound reasonable. You really want to stand here reading legal forms after everything you've been through? He said it like I was being difficult already, like asking to understand something was a burden. I should have asked the nurse to wait, that I should have asked for my glasses, that I should have said no. Instead, I took the pen. I signed once, then again, then a third time. Daniel turned the pages quickly, faster than anyone turns pages unless they already know exactly where the signatures belong. When I handed the clipboard back, he gave a short nod. Good, he said. Just good. Not, I'm glad you're coming home. Not, we were worried about you. Not even, take it easy. Just good. On the drive back, Vanessa talked about medication schedules and low-sodium meals. Daniel talked about keeping stress down. I watched the bare February trees slide by the car window and told myself I was just exhausted. That was all. Exhausted men imagine things. But when we pulled into the driveway, I felt something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was the first thin crack in trust. That night, I slept badly. I woke up 3 times, confused by the silence, then by the unfamiliar sound of Vanessa moving around in the kitchen downstairs before sunrise. I remember staring at the ceiling and thinking how strange it was that a man could survive a heart attack and still feel less unsettled by that than by a clipboard and one sentence from his own son. The next morning, I began to understand why. From the outside, nothing had changed. The same white siding. The same porch light Margaret always forgot to switch off in the morning. The same rose bushes by the walkway, though now they looked thin and neglected from winter. Inside, everything looked almost right. That was the problem. The coffee tin was gone from its shelf by the stove. The mugs had been moved to a lower cabinet. The small entry table where I had always left bills, bank envelopes, and church mail was empty except for a ceramic bowl Vanessa had placed there with decorative pine cones in it, as though the house were a waiting room. I stood in the kitchen longer than I should have, trying to remember whether I'd been the one to move things before the hospital. Age does that to you. It doesn't erase your memory. It just makes you wonder if you're still entitled to trust it. When Daniel came downstairs, already dressed for work, I asked, "Where's my bank folder?" He opened the refrigerator before answering. "What bank folder?" "The brown accordion file. Statements, trust papers, tax notices." "Oh." He kept looking into the fridge. "Vanessa straightened things up while you were away. It's probably in the study." The study door was locked. That had never happened before. I checked it later when Daniel left for work and Vanessa was upstairs showering. The knob wouldn't turn. I stood there with my hand on it, staring at the brass lock Margaret and I had installed 20 years ago after a neighborhood break-in. It had almost never been used. Vanessa saw me when she came down the hallway drying her hair. "Daniel's organizing your paperwork," she said. "You really don't need to worry about any of that right now. Stress isn't good for your recovery." There it was. That phrase. You don't need to worry about it. At lunch, I tried logging into my bank account on the tablet I kept in the den. My password didn't work. I tried again more carefully. Same result. I went to the desk drawer where I kept the small spiral notebook with passwords and account notes. It wasn't there. I found it later in the kitchen, shoved into the bottom drawer under old takeout menus, loose batteries, and a broken flashlight. That was the moment I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. Over the next 2 days, I became very quiet. Not passive. Quiet. There's a difference, though younger people rarely understand it. When you're old, silence is often the last place you still have full control. I started noticing patterns. Mail no longer reached me first. Vanessa brought it in, sorted it, and left only advertisements and magazines on the table. Daniel began ending conversations before they started. I'll handle it. You don't need to think about that. Just focus on getting stronger. The fireproof lockbox Margaret kept in the hallway closet was gone. That box held the deed to the house, our marriage certificate, old wills, life insurance papers, and a handful of letters from our early years that Margaret called the documents that mattered most, legal or otherwise. Where's the lockbox? I asked over dinner that second night. Vanessa answered before Daniel could. Safer upstairs. Safer from whom? I wanted to ask, from burglars, from me? But I didn't. That night, after they went upstairs, I sat in the den with Margaret's old knitted blanket over my knees and looked at the photographs on the mantel. Daniel at age 8 with a missing front tooth. Daniel at 16 in his Little League uniform, even though by then he was too tall to look little in anything. Margaret in every photo, never posing, just being there, steady, warm, practical, the center without ever demanding to be seen as one. I missed her most in moments that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with uncertainty. She had a way of noticing the second layer beneath things. She could hear falseness in a sentence before anyone else had even realized it was there. Once, years ago, when a contractor tried to rush us into signing an agreement for kitchen repairs, Margaret took the papers from my hand and said, "Anytime someone wants your signature faster than your understanding, they're hoping one of them gets there first." At the time, I had laughed. Now, sitting in the dark den of a house that no longer felt fully mine, I thought of that line. So clearly it was like hearing her say it from the doorway. On the third morning, I called a cab. I didn't tell Daniel or Vanessa where I was going. The bank was only 15 minutes away, but the ride felt longer. The driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, probably because old men in winter coats don't usually look that tense at 10 in the morning. Inside, the assistant manager, his name tag said Trevor, helped me into a chair and asked what I needed. "I want to review recent activity on my accounts," I said. He smiled the polite, distant smile bank employees use when they expect to spend 3 minutes helping you. Then he pulled up my file. The smile disappeared. Not dramatically, just enough. "Sir," he said, "when did you authorize a secondary signer on your trust-linked account?" I felt my stomach drop. My what? He turned the monitor slightly toward me. There was my name. The trust account Margaret had set up years earlier. And beneath it, under temporary authorized access, was another name. Daniel Mercer. Authorization date, 3 days earlier. Hospital hallway. Clipboard. My signature. For a second, I couldn't hear anything. Not the teller windows. Not the printer behind him. Not even Trevor's voice when he asked if I was all right. "Can he move money?" I asked. "Limited operational access," Trevor said carefully. "Not ownership." "Has he tried?" He hesitated, then nodded. There were transfer attempts. Some were flagged for review by the trust department. "What about the house?" "That's still fully protected under the trust," he said. There was a request for trust-related property documentation, but no ownership change. My hands started trembling. I folded them together in my lap so he wouldn't see. It wasn't confusion I felt then. It was humiliation. At 72, after a lifetime of paying bills, raising a son, burying a wife, and trying to remain decent in a world that keeps rewarding the opposite, I had been tricked into signing something I didn't understand because I was weak and wanted to go home. Trevor lowered his voice. "Sir, I can't give legal advice, but I strongly recommend you speak with the attorney who drafted the trust documents." I nodded. "I didn't know what I was signing," I said. His expression softened, but only slightly. "That happens more often than it should." He printed out the activity summary and trust notes he was allowed to share. I slipped the papers into an envelope and held it against my chest on the way out of the bank like it was something fragile. Maybe it was. Maybe it was the last piece of proof I needed that my instincts were still intact. Richard Hale had been our estate lawyer for years. Older now. Thinner. Same rimless glasses. Same careful way of speaking. When I sat down across from him and told him what happened, he didn't interrupt. He just listened. Then he read the bank papers, opened our file, and took out the trust documents Margaret had signed years earlier. "Your wife was thorough," he said. That was the first kind sentence I had heard all week. He explained it plainly. Daniel's access was real, but temporary. It allowed him to help manage certain transactions during a medical recovery period. It did not transfer ownership. It did not give him the power to sell the house. It did not make him a trustee. More importantly, Margaret had built-in protections. If temporary access was used for self-dealing, pressure, or asset redirection beyond recovery-related needs, it could be revoked immediately. She planned for coercion? I asked. Richard chose his answer carefully. She planned for possibility. That sounded like Margaret too. Never dramatic. Never naive. She knew people change under stress, he continued. Illness in a family tends to reveal character quickly. I looked down at the papers. Daniel thought he had a key. What he really had was permission to stand near the door. Richard prepared revocation papers that same afternoon. I read every line slowly. Not because I suddenly enjoyed legal language, but because I now understood the cost of pretending I didn't need to. When I finished signing, Richard said, "He moved too fast. That's what saved you." I nodded, but inside I was thinking something else. No, what saved me was Margaret. Margaret, even dead, had still been trying to protect me. That night, after I came home, Daniel called down from upstairs. "Dad, did you go to the bank today?" I looked at the television without really seeing it. "Yes." A pause. "There's some kind of issue with the account." "Is there?" He came downstairs a minute later, pretending to be calm. Vanessa stood behind him in the hallway, arms crossed. "It's probably a verification problem," he said. "Probably," I answered. He waited for me to ask more. I didn't. The next morning, I heard Vanessa speaking on the phone in the kitchen before she realized I was awake. "He must have changed something," she whispered. "No, he signed it." I was right there. She turned and saw me standing in the doorway. Her face went blank instantly. Not guilty. Not ashamed. Blank. "Coffee?" she asked. That was when I knew for certain this wasn't misunderstanding or overhelpfulness or some badly executed attempt to manage things. This was deliberate. Not loud. Not clumsy. Deliberate. And once you know that about someone, a lot of their past behavior rearranges itself in your mind. I started remembering the way Daniel had gradually taken over little things after Margaret died. How often Vanessa had said, "That might be too much for you right now." How easily both of them had started treating my life like a room they could reorganize if they just kept their voices calm. By that afternoon, panic had started showing through the cracks. Daniel was opening drawers, checking his laptop, making calls from the upstairs bedroom with the door half shut. Once, I heard him say, "Why would he do this now?" That question stayed with me. Not, "Why did we do this to him?" Not, "Maybe we went too far." Not even, "We should explain." Just, "Why would he do this now?" As though my resistance were the mystery. 2 nights later, Daniel asked if we could sit down and talk through the misunderstanding. We sat at the dining table Margaret had refinished by hand 20 years earlier. I remember because she spent an entire week sanding and staining it in the garage, and when I said we could have bought a new one cheaper, she told me, "Some things are worth saving because they're yours." Vanessa placed the same hospital papers on the table. "We were trying to help," she said. "By locking my study." I asked. Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, you were recovering. We had to take care of things." "For whom?" I asked. Neither of them answered. "Why was my password notebook moved?" Silence. "Why did the trust department get a request tied to the house?" That landed. Daniel's face tightened. "You signed the authorization." "Yes," I said, while weak, medicated, and without reading it. "We weren't stealing from you. You were taking control of things that weren't yours." "That's not fair." Fair. That word sat in the room like a bad smell. I thought of Margaret sitting at this same table, balancing checkbooks, clipping coupons, writing birthday cards, making sure every bill was paid and every promise kept. Fair used to live in this house. It didn't anymore. "I met with Richard Hale," I said. Everything changed right there. Vanessa stopped pretending. Daniel stopped acting concerned. The performance was over. Once they knew I had a lawyer, Daniel dropped the careful tone. "It's not like I was going to throw you out," he said. That sentence hit harder than anything else he'd said, because it meant he had already imagined it. Maybe discussed it. Maybe justified it. Maybe turned it into one more practical option in the quiet private language he now shared with his wife. "So what was the plan?" I asked. "Sell the house. Move funds around. Put me somewhere smaller and call it safer." He looked away. "We were exploring options. Without me. About me. Using my signature." Then he said the ugliest thing of all. "You're not thinking clearly since the heart attack." That one almost got me. For 1 second, I felt it. That old person's terror. That brief, poisonous question. What if he's right? What if everyone else can see decline in me that I can't see myself? Then I remembered the bank screen, the flag transfers, the locked study, Margaret's warnings, Richard's file folder, Vanessa whispering in the kitchen. No. I looked directly at my son and said, I'm thinking clearly enough to know you waited until I was weak. He didn't answer. That told me more than any confession could have. Richard came to the house the next afternoon. No drama, no threats, no raised voices, just facts. He placed the documents on the dining table and explained, one clause at a time, exactly what Margaret had built into the trust. Temporary authority, revocable access, no transfer of ownership, no power to sell the residence. Automatic review triggered by irregular activity. Daniel's access had already been revoked. His attempts were documented. Further interference could expose him to legal consequences. Vanessa asked, so he can just cut us off? Richard looked at her and said, he can protect what belongs to him. Daniel went pale, but he still didn't apologize. That told me something too. People who are sorry usually speak before the lawyer does. After Richard left, Daniel stood by the window for a long time. Finally he asked, without turning around, you really think I'd hurt you? I answered honestly, I think you already did. Richard told me I had options. I could stay and force boundaries. I could legally require Daniel and Vanessa to leave. I could restructure the trust further. I could fight. But all I could think about was how tired I felt in that house now. Not physically, spiritually. Every room had become divided between memory and suspicion. Margaret's garden gloves still hung by the mudroom door. Her recipe cards were still in the kitchen. But upstairs, behind closed doors, lived two people who had mistaken my weakness for opportunity. I no longer wanted to defend my life room by room. So I made another choice. I found a small cottage across town near the public gardens Margaret loved. One floor, quiet street, narrow porch, enough room for my chair, my books, my coffee, and the pieces of my life that still felt honest. I signed the lease a week later. This time, I read every page twice. When the movers came, I packed Margaret's photograph myself. Then the recipe box. Then the small ceramic sugar bowl with the chipped edge that she refused to throw out because it had belonged to her mother. You learn a lot about a life when it's time to put it in boxes. The expensive things matter less than you'd think. It's the ordinary objects that break you open. Daniel stood in the doorway while the last of my things were loaded into the van. He offered to help twice. I said no twice. At the car, I turned back and looked at him. I wanted to ask when, exactly, I had become a problem to solve instead of a father. I wanted to ask if Vanessa had started the conversation or simply made it easier for him to continue. I wanted to ask whether he had ever planned to tell me what the hospital papers really were. Instead, I said the only thing that mattered. Your mother built something better than this. He looked down. So did I added. Then I got in the car and left. I had walked out of hospitals before. Funeral homes too. But leaving my own house felt stranger than either of them. It has been 7 months. My blood pressure is better. I walk every morning when the weather allows. There's a bakery 2 blocks away run by a woman who calls me honey and always remembers I like my coffee black. On quiet afternoons, I sit on the porch and think about Margaret. Daniel calls sometimes. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes I let it ring. We are not estranged in the dramatic way television teaches people to imagine. There was no shouting match. No courtroom spectacle. No final slam door. Just a truth that lives between us now. He asked for trust at the moment I was least able to protect myself. And he used it. That's what remains. Not the documents. Not the bank. Not even the house. That moment. People think betrayal is loud. They think it arrives shouting or breaking things. Often it doesn't. Sometimes it comes in a calm voice. Sometimes it comes with a clipboard. Sometimes it says, just trust me. Because it knows exactly when you're too tired to argue. I don't regret going to the bank. I don't regret calling Richard. And strange as it sounds, I don't even regret signing that day. Because if I hadn't, I might have gone on believing that love and loyalty were still doing work in that house that they had already stopped doing. Now I know better. Trust isn't what people ask for. It's what they prove they deserve. And dignity, especially at my age, is not something you keep by winning fights. Sometimes you keep it by leaving quietly before the fight turns you into someone you no longer recognize. Margaret understood that. She understood that love, when it's wise enough, can protect you long after the person is gone. It can sit in file drawers, in closets, in careful signatures, in plans made years ahead by someone who hoped they'd never be needed. She saved me, not with force, with foresight. And that, to me, is still the most moving part of all this. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. And tell me where you're listening from. I still like knowing how far a story can travel, especially one that taught me, a little late but not too late, that the most dangerous words in a family are not always the cruelest ones. Sometimes they are the gentlest. Sometimes they sound like care. Sometimes they sound like trust. And sometimes, if you are lucky enough to see clearly in time, they teach you exactly who deserves a place in your life and who only wanted access to it.